I missed the question. Mine is
I'm going to go soldier.
Did you read it?
Ready?
Well, maybe this other that was like a light one, which is funny.
Oh, yeah, we're good.
This other one is so good.
I want to welcome all of you to today's panel discussion on morality and capitalism. I'm Chris Serpernot, Assistant Professor of Philosophy and the Director of the Alexis de Tocqueville Project in Law, Liberty, and Morality here at the University of New Orleans. Before introducing our guests, I'd like to thank some people that have made this event and all of our programming here at the university possible. This includes the Charles Koch Foundation, the University of New Orleans Student Government Association, the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University, and a number of local companies and private donors, including and especially the law firm of Adams and Reese, Joseph and Mary Looney, and Mark and Monica Serpernot. For those of you unfamiliar with the Tocqueville Project, it was established to examine enduring questions in the history of Western moral and political thought. To that end, we host public events such as this panel discussion, seminars in philosophy and political economy, faculty and student reading groups, and a summer program to provide New Orleans residents with an opportunity to explore these issues at greater depth. Today, our focus is on a topic that has generated quite a bit of attention in the past few months. It seems that an ever-increasing number of people are unhappy with what they believe to be a condition of ever-increasing inequality in the world. And rightly or wrongly, most of them seem to believe that capitalism is to blame. Most recently, Pope Francis weighed in on this issue, and he wrote, so this is not that long, but it's a little bit to put this in context. So he said, just as the commandment, thou shalt not kill, sets a clear limit in order to safeguard the value of human life, today we also have to say, thou shalt not, to an economy of exclusion and inequality. Today, everything comes under the laws of competition and the survival of the fittest, where the powerful feed on the powerless. As a consequence, masses of people find themselves excluded and marginalized, without work, without possibilities, without any means of escape. Human beings are themselves considered consumer goods to be used and then discarded. We've created a throwaway culture, which is now spreading. And he continues, in this context, some people continue to defend trickle-down theories, which assume that economic growth encouraged by a free market will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. This opinion, which never has been confirmed by the facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. Meanwhile, the excluded are still waiting. The culture of prosperity deadens us. We are thrilled if the market offers us something new to purchase. In the meantime, all those lives stunted for lack of opportunity seem a mere spectacle. They fail to move us. But is the Pope correct? Is capitalism to blame for all, many, or even some of our social ills? Is capitalism as an economic system moral? Or are its principles somehow fundamentally inconsistent with right behavior? Joining us today to discuss these issues are Bradley Hobbs and James Payne. Bradley Hobbs is the BB&T Professor of Free Enterprise and Professor of Economics at Florida Gulf Coast University. He received his PhD in economics from Florida State University in 1991. His research interests are wide-ranging across finance and economics. His recent work addressed cost efficiency in long-term care institutions, the costs of AACSB faculty turnover, the effects of property rights on debt for nature swaps, and pedagogical issues in the teaching of finance and economics. Most recently, Brad served as the president for the Association of Private Enterprise Education. James Payne is the Bank One Professor of Business and the Provost here at the University of New Orleans. He received his PhD in economics from Florida State University in 1989. Jim has been recognized nationally and internationally for his research productivity. Even as provost, he continues to pursue an active research agenda, having published over 200 articles in economics and finance. His research has been funded through grants and fellowships from, among others, the J. William Fulbright Foreign Scholarship and the Council for International Exchange of Scholars, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the American Institute for Economic Research. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bradley Hobbs and Provost James Payne. So Brad's going to take on the Pope. Good luck. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, welcome, and I do know that we're on a topic that certainly brings emotion to the top, and I'll do my best to work through my side of it. I came to economics because of an interest in actually Latin American history, an interest in how to make life better. I kind of went full circle in my career, and I have become pretty much a staunch libertarian. So I've made a personal journey through this. And I would say that I would dare say that the Pope has it wrong. The notion of a trickle-down theory, to even accept that term is kind of bizarre in the sense that no self-respecting economist has ever said that's a theory that we ought to use, has defended that theory. The term trickle-down actually came from Will Rogers, a 20th century humorist, and it has a lot more political content than it does economic content. Its life has been fed by politicians for political purposes, and we should be leery of that, I think. I actually, in a very crude way to just make my point, did some Wikipedia searches. I know that as academics we're never supposed to look at Wikipedia. But I Googled federal political scandals in the United States. The article begins in 1777. It's 43 pages long as of last week. State political scandals yields 43 pages. It begins in 1778. Of course, we may be here to focus on corporate scandals. The score is 82 pages for corporate scandals, 86 pages for political scandals. The win goes to the political class. Politicians are not alone. I got on the plane, took my New York Times from the university, and opened it up. I looked down to the bottom corner, and here's the national page yesterday. The two national stories that are leading are ex-governor of Virginia is indicted on grafts over loans and gifts. The second one is in files a history of sexual abuse by priests in Chicago Archdiocese. Both are disturbing to read, particularly the second one. Religious scandals get 77 pages. They can't beat the politicians, but no one can. Organized religions have a vast, horrendous closet full of skeletons. The Catholic Church, of course, has problems with dealing with pedophilia. In 1578, under Directorum Inquisitorium, which served as the definitive handbook for inquisitors of the Catholic Church, we are told that for punishment, it does not take place primarily per se for correction and the good of the person being punished, but for the public good, in order that others may become terrified and weaned away from the evils that they commit. I don't think we need to go too far into the church's treatment of sexual scandals, but I would venture to say that oftentimes the preservation of the hierarchy and of the power of the church took precedence over children and even the priests themselves that had these problems. Hardly the Catholic Church alone. We have a local, Jimmy Swaggart. We have Ted Haggard. We have the Jonestown Massacre. In the Jonestown Massacre, 909 people were convinced to take a mass revolutionary suicide together. If you listen to the tapes of the last hour or two of the Jonestown Massacre, there's a line that was read to the people under the People's Temple. Go down in history saying you choose your own way to go, and it is your commitment to refuse capitalism and in support of socialism. While Wikipedia is a very crude indicator, I think it makes the point that I want to make, and it is this. Human fallibility and imperfectibility exist in any human structure. As Immanuel Kant told us in 1784, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing has ever been made. So I completely concede, and I accept that there are problems of human morality and that they pervade human institutions. But I think that we have a situation where many see evil in every nook and cranny of capitalism. But the same seers are suddenly unwilling to see this evil if they look at institutions that they like. To be consistent and to be fair, we must be even-handed. We all ought to concede, I think, that every institution is fraught with human imperfection. And capitalism has no unique claim on human foibles. In short, in this short introduction, I'm going to go with a worldly philosopher view, which are what the economists are. We're dabblers in philosophy. And take a utilitarian perspective, or utilitarian defense of capitalism. There's an immense weight of evidence, contrary to what the Pope says in his encyclical, that capitalism has contributed. It does lift boats. It does so at different rates. It does so at different times. But in general, I think there's mounds of evidence that things have been better as a result of capitalism. Countries in the top quartile of economic freedom have documentable, consistent, and significant relative gains in these sorts of measures. Per capita GDP, income share for the poorest 10%, per capita GDP growth among developing nations, political rights, civil rights, women's rights, reductions in corruption, life satisfaction, male literacy and female literacy, and life expectancy of birth. These measures are important, and they represent human well-being and flourishing. We should take them seriously. Most consider the mid-18th century to mark the beginnings of the much-maligned Industrial Revolution. There's no serious scholar out there who doubts that by 1820 that this had started, nor do any deny the immense changes that this revolution brought to humankind. The question, of course, is, and why we're here tonight, I suspect, were these changes for the better or for the worse? My answer is unequivocal. Mankind is better off. We've been served by capitalism. Let's compare the life of an average American in 1870 to the person in 2007. That's 137 years, which in the scope of history is a very short time. I have 4 variables that I've picked. A host of others are available, but I thought these 4 would be good. One is the age at which we begin work. The second is life expectancy. The third is average length of retirement. And the fourth is the percent of time spent awake and working. In 1870, the average worker began as a prepubescent 13-year-old. That was the average age of beginning work, was 13. 80 years later, it was 17 and a half. This is in 1950. And by 2007, it was age 20. This is a significant shift. The average American in 1870 started with their working lives as children. And oftentimes, like many of today's poor do, they clamored to choose labor in a sweatshop or manufacturing plant over rural life on a farm. Second, the average life expectancy in 1870 was 43 and a half years. Many people in this room have expired, including myself. In 1950, it was 67 years. By 1973, it was just over 70 and a half. The 2013 figures for life expectancy in the United States are 81 years for women and 76 years for men in the United States. As far as retirement is a word that our ancestors knew nothing about. In 1870, the average length of retirement was 0. But by 1950, it was still 0. Until 1970, the number is 6.6 years. And in 2007, the average American has enjoyed almost 16 years of retirement. The fourth and final measure is the percent of time awake and working, which is one of my favorite measures. In their lifetimes, our ancestors in 1870 spent an inordinate amount of time working. The average workday in 1870 for an American was 14 and a half hours. 61% of each day was awake and working. By 1950, this had dropped to 45%, which is just over 10 and a half hours. So in 1950, your grandparents perhaps had 10 and a half hour work days. By 1973, it was 8 and a half hours. And in 2007, we spent 28% of our time awake and working, which is 6.8 hours. So in 1870, our work day was 14 and a half hours. 2007, it was under 7 hours. And I think that's a phenomenal change. These data indicate monumental gains in human history, and I also consider them to be a direct result of Industrial Revolution, which is the ism that we call capitalism. The term capitalism was originated by Marx, and it was hardly a kudo, it was a derogatory term. It fit well with his worldview. I think that Marx was an astute critic of capitalism and saw many of the problems with capitalism. And he laid out in his magnum opus a story that set labor against capital. Interestingly, he did not set capital against labor. Marx is quite taken with capitalists in the sense that he says capitalists are hapless pawns in the system, and they respond the way they have to respond given the way the system grinds them down. The historical reality is that capital turns out to be tremendously helpful to labor. Productivity is what leads to the kinds of increases in per capita income that I'm talking about and the four variables that I talked about. According to the best work that we have on historical per capita real GDP by Addison Magnus, the numbers that we are looking at in Western Europe at the time of the birth of Christ was about $600 per capita. This is adjusted for inflation in real dollars as best we can do it over long scopes of economic history. $600. By the year 1000, it had dropped 30% to $425. The Dark Ages were not nice to anyone. Between 1000 and 1500, we observe a very, very slow rise, so that by 1500, that figure is about $770 per capita. By 1820, which is 320 years, at the beginning of the unleashing of capitalism on the world, the annual per capita GDP was about $1,200. This is very low. So in your mind, you can picture this as sort of just a flat line with a bit of a fall and a bit of a rise until about 1820. But if you look at the data, then things simply take off. In the next 80 years, we see a 150% growth rate, eclipsing the entire previous 1,800 years. By 1900, annual per capita GDP was about $3,000, just over $3,000. Over the next century, this figure grew sevenfold. And the number for Europe, Western Europe, was 22,246 at the turn of the millennium. So between 1820 and 2008, the per capita GDP in Western Europe grew 1,700%. This is stunning in historical terms, and I don't believe it's because God suddenly smiled upon us and said, "Suddenly I like you." I think there were reasons for this. Your response may be, well, that's great for Europe. How about the rest of the world? And I would tell you that the news there is good and hopeful. There's two short quotes from a recent paper that's quite influential. World poverty is falling, and new estimates of the world's income distribution suggest that world poverty is disappearing faster than previously thought. In 1970, from 1970 to 2006, poverty fell by 86% in South Asia, 73% in Latin America, 39% in the Middle East, and 20% in Africa. By the way, does anyone know what countries the highest growth rates of GDP are today? Africa. Africa is turning a corner, and I think it's a very historical corner. Although world population has increased by 80% over the time of the study, 80%, the number of people below the $1-a-day poverty line has shrunk by 64%, from nearly a billion people, 967 million in 1970, to 350 million in 2006. The authors state, in the past 36 years, there has never been a moment with more than 1 billion people in poverty, and barring a catastrophe, there will never be such a moment in the future history of the world. If you want a visual for how far we have come internationally, search YouTube for Hans Rosling's video called 200 Countries, 200 Years, 4 minutes. It is in 4 minutes, and you will see the data that Hans Rosling has. It's great. So in closing, I willingly concede that capitalism has faults. It too is imperfect, being wrought from the crooked timber of humanity. Bad actors exist in business, but they exist in politics, and they exist in religious institutions. All collective human endeavors provide an opportunity for scoundrels to be scoundrels. And the evidence to me is clear. To overlook the realities of the growth of capitalism, to twist, warp, and misrepresent its significant contributions to human flourishing is disingenuous. Even the infamous Bono, a rock star, world philanthropist, and leading proponent of government aid, now admits, quote, Commerce and entrepreneurial capitalism take more people out of poverty than aid. In dealing with poverty here and around the world, welfare and foreign aid are band-aids, and free enterprise is the cure. Imperfect capitalism, yes, it is imperfect, but no more flawed than any other human institution, including those that constantly flout moral superiority. Capitalism suffers from the same imperfections that all human institutions suffer, and despite this, I think capitalism provides the surest method for human action to bring the poorest of the poor out of poverty and to improve the lot of mankind. Choose well, the future of human flourishing hangs in the balance.
How do you follow that?
Oh, I'm going to do a counterpoint from Saturday Night Live. Saturday Night Live, we say that right there. So the first, it's good to see Brad because we went to graduate school together. And it was funny because, I don't know, the younger crowd in here, Red Hot Chili Peppers, you probably remember the group. They're old people. We are. He introduced me to Red Hot Chili Peppers in 1985. So it's kind of funny when he mentioned the fact that he went from this, I don't want to call it socialist, but
I was
yeah,
pretty
he's pretty
left.
hardcore, and then all of a sudden, oh, sorry, I did. Sorry, got my thing right there. Sorry about that. And now he's gone full circle to libertarian mode, which is shocking. And so, you know,
We change over time.
yeah, and I don't know how I've evolved. I don't know. It's really gone. But I think the point that I wanted to make, and given he's libertarian and maybe he'll chime in, is that I think, given the discussion centering around the Pope's comments, and you know, when I look at the morality of capitalism, he's focusing on growing income inequality, and I think there's something there that we need to probably talk about further. Is that I think Brad and I would agree that capitalism, you know, the question is how you define it, and I think one aspect of it is it does create, the premise under capitalism is access. And in terms of taking talent and having labor markets that function right in terms of your ability to raise capital and so forth, and the ability to be innovative in terms of how you do things and so forth, as he alluded to a number of statistics of how these quality of life indicators have shown improvement over time. But that's missing an underlying problem that I see, and I think I'll be interested to see Brad's comments on the income distribution aspects of it, because I think what the Pope is focusing in on is this growing gap between haves and have-nots, and it's really a concern. So in a sense that you know, in terms of addressing that, I look at it as the problems of even with capitalism. This is why I want to hear Brad's point of view, to what extent he's on the libertarian spectrum. Of, you know, the fact is, I think Brad would have to agree that at some point we need government at some level, if nothing else, to ensure property rights, enforcement of property rights, and so forth. Do you disagree with that one?
I'm a minarchist. I'll cede minarchist.
Well, we're going down a different path then. But I think the thing with capitalism we have to make sure of, because if you have a growing income inequality problem, then you're going to have potential unrest. I mean, if the income inequality gets too out of whack, then I think there's questions about the idea of social justice, the income distribution as well. And I think you saw it in the Arab Spring in terms of a lot of unrest there, and a lot of it dealt with in terms of access, in terms of having highly educated people not having access to jobs and so forth, or having access to move up. And in that sense, capitalism, if it exists, is not helping. But capitalism, when you have access and you promote access to get the most talented people, will work. But the question is, how can you ensure access? Because the biggest thing that's happened with the income inequality in this country is the fact that with technological innovations, it's becoming more and more apparent that skilled labor force and so forth, access to education is critical. And so what's happening now with the way the government's viewing education is making it more and more difficult for people on the margin to be able to afford or have access to education, whatever level it might be. And so I think that's something that I think there's a role for government to work in concert with industry. Brad and I think we would agree there's a lot of inefficiencies in government, and there's a lot of things the markets could do better in terms of government services and how they're distributed. and also dealing with externalities on the margin. But I think the big thing I think that the Pope's trying to get at is the income inequality that you see. And it's to the point you see it in some countries get so severe, and that's where you get civil unrest and so forth. And then it kind of really then it becomes a problem in terms of, oh, we want capitalism, but you know, if you got too much political unrest, then trying to get an infusion of foreign capital in a country becomes difficult because you become a political risk. So there's a balancing act here that the government needs to be aware of. And I think corporate leaders need to be aware of it. So that's just some general, I like to steer the conversation about the inequality piece if possible.
I would say I think it's quite inevitable that you'll get inequality under capitalism. I think that's not really an issue. You will get it. How you deal with it is a political issue. It's not a capitalism issue. The question is, well, does capitalism produce enough wealth for you to even worry about splitting up the wealth? And the answer would be yes, I think it does. Long term, societies have to make these decisions, and the question, of course, is how do we make the decision? Do we do democracy? A lot of people are enthralled with democracy. I'm less enthralled with democracy than I used to be, because 51% of Americans decided that blacks should be slaves, and they were. And we have to be very careful about democracy. I think the republic is a good idea relative to democracy. As far as income inequality, you're absolutely right. I think it does produce certain social pressures that are very difficult. But we also know that people judge their position in society in very relativist terms. That is, I have a friend, one of my favorite things to ask immigrants. I like immigrants. I have a lot of friends that are immigrants. I have a very libertarian view of immigration. And I ask all my immigrant friends I've become close enough to, what in the first month or so you were here was the most shocking thing or cultural adjustment that you was just off in Mars as far as you were concerned? My friend from Singapore said it was the cereal aisle at the grocery store. He had no idea what was in those boxes. But a more telling one was a friend of mine had a buddy that was in graduate school in finance. It was Indian. And he said, in India, poor people are not fat. He said, I had no idea. I thought these were wealthy people. And if you go to the poor, or you go to poorer sections of the world, large people, particularly large Americans, are always thought to be wealthy. So we judge things in very relativistic terms. And I think that if I had to make a choice behind Rawls' veil of ignorance, and I had a choice to live in America as a poor person or to live in Guatemala as a rich person, and had to throw dice about where I was going to land on the distribution, I think I'd take America every single time. It's tough to be poor. I was poor. Jim and I were poor. Remember the house I lived in?
Yeah.
For years I was poor. We lived on stipends that were very, very small. But I was investing, and I was lucky. I had help. I had a family that valued education. I mean, I think these things matter. But the inequality certainly does cause a problem. How you deal with it is another story. Milton Friedman basically said we just have negative income tax. I mean, if we're going to do this, my position would be have a negative income tax. Get rid of every system, every program, all the bureaucracy associated.
What is a negative income tax?
Well, the negative income tax would be to guarantee someone a minimum income. Just say the minimum income of the year is $20,000, here you go, or whatever the number is. But keep work incentives within that structure so you can layer the subsidies to the negative income tax.
So if I'm unemployed, the government would pay me $20,000 under that approach?
They would,
Okay.
right, under a negative income tax approach. I think that would be a much more efficient way to deal with the problem that we have rather than the systems that we have in place now. We've talked a little bit, you and I were talking in the office before we came over about the problems with the card. What's the Louisiana card?
Louisiana purchase card.
Yes, and black market problems. I mean, these issues occur. People figure out ways around the system. And, you know, if we were going to do something, I would go with a negative income tax. I mean, it just makes more sense to me. But you have to have the right incentive structures so people still want to be productive and want to work. I think a lot of people want to be productive and work. But I do know people who really don't. I know some of them. And they just kind of want to hang out, which is okay. I mean, I don't have any problem with that. Just be responsible for it, that's all. That's all I would ask is, you know, if that's what you want to do, it's your life. I mean, that's a very libertarian position, but I can't make decisions for you. I don't know what your life is like. I don't know what you value the most. I don't know what you want to spend your time doing, and I don't want that responsibility. As I tell my students, I have 2 children. That was enough. I took care of 2 kids. That was enough.
So the solution to Jim's question about inequality is the negative income tax. Something along those lines to help people who are presumably worse off, in some cases due to no fault of their own.
Well, you said the solution. I would say it is a solution.
Well, because I was going to ask next, how do you get that solution if you combine it with the anarchic position that you responded to Jim before? Because the two don't seem to go together.
When I say a solution, I didn't say it was my solution.
What's your solution then?
My solution is a much more difficult solution. It really is. It's an anarchic solution. And that is that we have a system that produces what it produces, and the use of force in any form of collective force or individual force to take property from other people is immoral. And I believe that. So if the collective decides that they want to take somebody's property, I don't think they have a right to do that. I think that the fundamental right that has to be protected is an individual right. If we stayed true to the Constitution, when we made the Constitution and we took it seriously, they would never have changed the words life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The reason property was taken out was because of black slaves. This country has a scar on it forever in history, and that is that at that moment, they couldn't do it. They couldn't put it together. They couldn't get the southern states to sign on, and they went with pursuit of happiness. They should have said property. Because if you have property over yourself and you choose not to be a slave, then you're not a slave anymore. And I think that defending those fundamental individual property rights and the rights of individuals is what we should defend. And Milton Friedman's got a great quote. He says, the ultimate minority is a minority of one. And if we protect those individual rights, that people have a life that they have to make decisions about. And making decisions about your life is probably what life is about.
What do you think, Jim? Do you think things shake out as nice as Brad wants to make them sound in that?
He's living in his own world. That's okay. So, I mean, I'll bring him back to reality now. So but no, I mean, I think that the issue, hopefully this is on, yes, that when you look at capitalism, and if you look at it, for those who get bombarded with it in the news media and how media is distributed now, it's kind of ideologically bent in different directions depending on what channel you're searching on, MSNBC to Fox and everything else like this. But the underlying thing with capitalism is you know, you have to have property rights, enforcement of the property rights, you know, access to voluntary trade and so forth. These are some fundamental things. Then the question is, what's the endowment you bring to that kind of marketplace? You know, what kind of skills do you bring? And so my focus back to the inequality question is, what has evolved now in terms of what we look at the U.S. as capitalism is very different than what most people would view capitalism. So right now, when I look at capitalism, I don't think the true form of capitalism is really in play. You know, I'm not denying it. There's benefits to capitalism, but what I see is I call it crony capitalism. And what I mean by that is that you see so many times, you see where you have the government involved, and there's a role for the government. Brad's going to the extreme. He doesn't want the government at all. Am I going? Is that fair to say?
No, the government has a role. It's to set the rules.
Okay, so you set the rules, but what's happened over time is that you see a lot of, I mean, why do people spend so much money for lobbying, for instance? The PACs and how they go about doing it. One of the biggest transfer programs is the subsidies to corporations, much more than any kind of welfare transfer payment you have to individuals. And then you have the layers of, you know, because of access issues, then you have a level of corruption. And having been in Louisiana only a year, I can see where the state ranks pretty high in that category. Well, Illinois did too. We have every other governor's and playing golf in a minimum security prison somewhere. But the fact is, when you have these things that creep up and they stout, oh, this is capitalism, we're all for it. when you peel it back and you look like, okay, were these people really that bright to be competing in a competitive market? My answer is generally no. You know, they got there in many cases through either a subsidy to start their business through the corporations and so forth like that. And so I think from other people that maybe are having difficult access, they look at that and they say, well, yeah, they're doing well now, but if you peel it back and ask how they got there, what path did they take? Yeah, there's a lot of things that, you know, wouldn't line with my definition of capitalism in terms of level playing field, in terms of the rules of the game. And I think sometimes what's happening now, I think the biggest problem is driving inequality is access to education, family stress. There's other socioeconomic factors driving it that are causing it. But, you know, I mean, I'm not naive to think that we're not going to have a tiered system in the U.S. Every country's going to have a tiered system. What I mean by that, you're going to have people that are going to be in an upper income bracket and so forth. I'm looking at the distribution of wealth and how it's skewed by just a few and the gap between it. I think if that grows too large, then you start having serious issues. But I don't look at our current system as a pure capitalist system, not because there's a government role, because I just think the way I see business conducted in general and how much the government is focused in areas that it's kind of like rent-seeking behavior. You know what that term is, right, Brian?
Yeah, and in fact, I may be more radical on this than you.
Oh, okay.
I think we're back in Smith's time. I think we have a mercantilist system right now that is deeply cronyist, and that's a huge problem. If I think it's 8 of the 10 richest counties are within 50 miles of Washington, D.C., you need to ask yourself, why is that and how did that happen? That's not random. I will never forget going to D.C. about a decade ago, and I was staying at a little hotel, and I was near K Street. And I'd always heard about K Street, but I'd never seen it. And I thought, I'll do my morning walk, and I'll get out and I'll walk. And as I'm walking, I'm thinking, I wonder how far I can go before I don't hit a lobbyist firm. And the answer is, in consecutive circles around the place that I was, an hour, about an hour, before I hit a firm that was not a lobbying firm. And that tells you something. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I would not defend America today as a capitalist system. It's not. If you want to see something, we're number 18 in economic freedom now. We've dropped from the top 8 or 9 to number 18. If you want to see a capitalist place, try Singapore, try Hong Kong, and look at Singapore and look at Hong Kong. They're rocks in the middle of the ocean with nothing but human talent. There is no natural resources, there's no oil, there's no trees, there's no of the natural resources you think bring wealth. The thing that brings wealth are human brains. And I'm of the belief that the more population we have, the better off we are, because genius is completely random. It's a black swan event. And the more that we have out there, population-wise, the more geniuses we're going to get. And I bow to geniuses. I'm not one. I long ago knew that I wouldn't win the Nobel Prize. It's okay. But when I think about the genius of the things that people have made, the computers that I have access to. When Jim and I went to work for one of our consulting firms, one of our professors at a consulting firm, and we analyzed race, sex, and age discrimination. And I remember I got a laptop. It had a green phosphorescent screen that if you didn't turn off, it would burn the screen. It had 640K of screaming RAM. It had the newest 20 meg hard drive. And I paid almost $3,000 for this thing in 1984, probably, maybe 1980. I still have the receipt. I could go find it because I kept it as a reminder. And I paid a lot of money. I mean, $3,000 for this thing. And look at what's happened. I mean, Bill Gates is, the company is brilliant. And the fact that Steve Jobs was competing with him, to me, is a good thing. I have both. I like to switch back and forth, right? I mean, I like to have an iPad or a PC. And so I wouldn't argue that we have a capitalist system at all. I think that would be just wrong-headed. We don't. In fact, I'd say we have far too much of a cronyist system. And I would say the reason for that is because if you make the rules, you can win the game. My children, I'd go off to play a game. I go, if you want to win, make sure that you can make the rules change at any time in the game. And that's true. If you can change the rules, you can change the winner of the game. And I do deplore that. I would not argue that we're capitalists.
So let me ask you this. Think about pure capitalist system now.
And to go back to Jim's point from before, if we're looking at a system where it's competition makes people better off or whatever else, what do we do with people who are worse off due to no fault of their own? So someone who's born either just, not a genius, or someone who's born with perhaps even a mental handicap. What do we do with them? It's because it seems like they just get left to the side, and if we're looking at a moral issue, there seems to be something not quite right about that.
I think from a historical perspective that families have done that for years. I know many families that have children that have Down syndrome or issues that are tough, and most of the families that I know of, that I'm aware of in the circles at least that I'm in, took on a tremendous amount of responsibility. And I think that's very difficult. And life does deal cards that sometimes we don't want to pick up. And that's difficult. But I think to ask the state to do it is to end up with what you have in orphanages in Ukraine and Russia. The state cannot care for you like your family can care for you. I'm back to Smith. Smith says that we should really, really worry in some sense about that which we can affect. And so I have a fundamental obligation. And that obligation is to my 2 daughters and my wife. And I will do all I can to take care of them. I have a brother, 2 brothers and a sister. The circle gets a little bigger. But let me ask you, how many of you get beyond second cousins? It's very difficult. And how could I really care in a way that I could have a real influence to someone who I have no idea who it is that lives in New Orleans, and I live in Florida? And maybe what I should do is focus on making sure that the little platoon that I'm in, I can do all I can do to help that. And if all of us did that, I think things would be better off. Now, some people aren't as lucky as I was. I had a grandfather who read books all the time. I thought people had books in libraries in their houses. I didn't know they didn't. Everybody I knew did. I mean, my dad had books. He read all the time. And so I realized that sometimes that's difficult. I am lucky. But my brother also has a child that's 14 years old that is a diabetic, juvenile diabetic. That kid will be on insulin for the rest of his life. His life is hampered. His life expectancy is lower. All kinds of things are going to result from this juvenile diabetes if it's not taken care of well. And my brother's taking care of it. I mean, and I think that's the obligation that we have. These social structures that you spoke to break down, and there are ramifications for that.
Jim, what do you think? Do you agree?
Well, yeah, I think everybody has to be cognizant of their own family situation, I think there's been an overall breakdown in a family structure, and you can break it down to ethnic groups and based on an educational level and so forth. But I think one thing that is important to remember is that one thing that's driving a lot of the problems, I think, I've been thinking about this, the breakdown of the family. You look at the average working family, you got the family, both parents are working, we're just kind of the early investment, the kid, till they get to school, they're thrown off to daycare somewhere. They're busy doing that. And so what's driving that? And I go back to the whole thing is that society's kind of involved with the technology and so forth. It's a faster pace of how jobs are changing and so forth. And I think part of the inequality that we see is that it's more and more difficult for people to adapt. Like if you go, I talked to my dad, he's in his upper 70s. I was like, yeah, we got out of high school, we were gonna work at the Ford factory, right? That's probably not a viable thing anymore. And people used to be able to high school education, to be able to go work, do well financially, support a family, where they had children, there's a caretaker for the kids early on and so forth. That's changed. I mean, the part of capitalism that is difficult and is challenging is the fact that, we had a few countries that are doing quite well, and then as companies kind of moved out and started to be more globalized. And then on top of that, you had the technological revolution in terms of information and so forth like this. markets are more integrated than ever before. Companies are just moving around, and you see it even more and more. So even though we're impacted by, I used to work up in Detroit. You know, we talk about an area that was very wealthy. Go to Flint, Michigan. In the 70s, they had the top 5 highest per capita incomes in the country. Go to Flint now, the reported unemployment rate is probably 30 or 40%. The real unemployment rate in certain groups is probably more like 50 or 60%. And this has been persisting for decades. And so part of it, they don't diversify the economic base, and part of it is that industries change. So the thing that I think people have to be aware of is to be more adaptable. And to be more adaptable goes back to my point, is that we have to have access to education where people continually get retrained, retooled to better themselves, to try to address some of the inequality questions. And so the question is, how can you go about doing that? And sometimes people do it on their own, but I do think, probably Brad doesn't maybe think this point of view, but I think there's a role for government in that, if nothing else, in terms of trying to position the economic base of the country. But the same thing is happening with, you know, the outsourcing that was a hot thing. We're now having back insourcing, supposedly. And that's the same thing, you know, I'm told it's called dynamic comparative advantage. You know, the whole park in Vietnam for a while, as soon as the standard of living increases, wages go up, they're go somewhere else. And it's not so much the wages are lower, it's not so much that workers here aren't productive. It's the wage productivity gap. And so they'll just keep moving around. And so it's not surprising. You know, China, a lot of companies moving out of China, and it's because of the wage productivity gap. The rising middle class there, wage pressure goes up, they're going, you know, Bangladesh looks good, let's go there. You know, close shop and go over there. And that's something that's a reality now, and I think society, you know, you see it. People are just, they depended on jobs in the past, but, you know, with high school education, that is no longer in play, because now capital is really mobile. And it goes from country to country, and sure, states and countries compete for the capital, but it's very mobile. And that's something I think is one factor driving some of the issues we face with inequality, because there's groups of people that haven't made the adjustment or are trying to create a way of access for them to address their situation, so you don't get the growing disparity. That's a challenge, but I think it's a very real one. And so going back to the Pope's comments, I can see where he would, on the surface, look at those comments going, this capitalism evil thing. The points, the statistics that Brad pointed out, I think, okay, I don't think many people can refute them, but the underlying question is, how can we address the inequality question? And that's a tough one.
So
I mean, it really is.
You and Brad brought it up, what do you think the appropriate role of government is in addressing that question?
Well, I mean, you know, Brad's probably got, you know, he's gone libertarian on me on the extreme here, but you know, I think one thing is, I find a role for government, okay? Beyond just maintaining property rights and sharing enforcement of property rights and so forth, judicial system. So what I see the role of government is that, and trust me, I think government's too big now in how it's operating, but I see the role of the government is to make sure, try to, either through market forces of the government itself, to minimize what we call asymmetric information problems, you know, the moral hazard issues you saw with the financial crisis. Adverse selection, moral hazard are two problems with asymmetric information, meaning that customers don't know. People are working one side of information, but you're putting your faith in another entity that has more information than you do. How to regulate that? Financial crisis obviously wasn't regulated very well with the mortgage-backed securities, but the example, the government had to step in. Brad would probably go counter, as an example, go counter to the government stepping in, but my argument would be that literally cash flow would just come to a halt. All short-term credit would come to a standstill. I'm not excusing the actions of those people developing these securities and so forth, but that's a role for government to try to control that, but also to provide some measure of investing, helping facilitate the investment in infrastructure in this country. We spend way too much time involved. If you take the amount of money we spend on wars across the globe, and you just took, you know, a quarter of that money, we wouldn't have problems with our infrastructure. Things are going to help growth. We got an aging infrastructure in this country. Look at the bridges, anyway. You look at the road system. We got a grid system that's open to terrorist attack at any time, or electrical grid. It's pretty easy. I mean, it's just, I mean, so we're so far behind infrastructure, public infrastructure in this country relative to other countries. That's where the government can help with the private sector to try to boost that to the benefit of the private sector.
What about taxation to help people who are harmed due to no fault of their own? So
Well, yeah,
Friends,
the negative income tax has been around since, I don't know, the 40s, whenever
Yeah,
Friedman
it's been
jotted
quite a
this. I
while.
see Neil back there. It's back in the
Earned income tax credit.
yeah. But that's what I'm saying. So there's things like this. Like right now, our tax code is like, it just smells of just rent-seeking behavior. I mean, it's just too damn large. I mean, it's painstaking to do the taxes. It's like, I mean, how much industry there? But I guarantee you, H&R Block's got one heavy lobbying arm in D.C. to make sure that tax code stays cumbersome for everybody. It could be totally streamlined. And when you see so much regulation like that, that's just the first thing. Yeah, there's no problem with regulation when you see it to this point, and that just smells to me as like, there's some rents people are capturing for their own benefit. But
should we take some questions?
That'd be fine.
Okay. Open things up.
Are you passing around the mic this time, or?
No, just speak up.
you want mine?
Oh, no, I definitely don't.
I don't even know if mine works.
I definitely don't need
idea.
anything
Hold
on the
on,
lapel.
just pause for a second, speak up so that the mics in the ceiling can pick you up.
Okay, so earlier y'all were, there was a little bit of a discussion and mention of externalities. Could the collapse of the American middle class be looked at as an externality of the globalization of our society in general, and the drive of corporations to increase profits and not caring that these people are losing jobs, the infrastructure is collapsing around them, governments are unable to fund themselves because these industries have left, and there's no other sources of income. And if it is an externality created by this kind of profit seeking by these corporations, does that not make it a moral problem?
I'll respond. Technically, an externality is not something that we don't like. Technically, an externality has to do with two parties coming to an agreement and imposing a cost on a third party. So if you live downstream and Jim and I make an agreement and he buys my stuff and I throw the refuse in the lake and it goes down to your house, I mean, that's an externality. But I think people use the term externality very loosely in the sense that it's just something that we don't like, so we call it an externality, and therefore the market's screwed up and we should be able to fix it with non-market mechanisms. I would say be very careful with non-market mechanisms. Market mechanisms have a way of working in the sense of self-correcting, and I'll go back to the 2007 downturn. A lot of what was set up in a move to increase housing. The American dream is to own a house. People did that. But if you look at housing rates, they've come back to where they were 30 years ago. And in that process, we took on a tremendous amount of debt. And we also did this. We said to bankers, you don't have to really play like a big boy. You don't really have to be at risk. We're going to fix it for you. And if you don't think that has impacts on future behavior, I think you're wrong. I think that the moral hazard problem that was set up by that bailout will come back to haunt us again. In your lifetime, young people, I think you'll see it again. Because now they know I'm too big to fail. And if I'm too big to fail and I'm going to get bailed out, they're going to act in certain ways that they wouldn't act if they truly were at risk. I mean, I don't have a problem with bankers going to jail. That's not an issue for me. I'm okay with that. In fact, I think it would be a good lesson.
Yeah. Let me go back, I mean, not to interrupt you, but talking about the housing thing, and I think this is something, Brad touched on it, and then go back to, you know, this income inequality piece. But the housing market, if you look at the Employment Act of 1946, around there, don't quote me exactly on the date, it specifically stabilizes, you know, to encourage home ownership. I mean, and, okay. in 1946. Again, you got to remember people coming off of World War II, people reconnecting, families starting, start of the, the baby boomers and everything that we see now, which is interesting. So there's always been a bias. I always found this fascinating. People wanting to buy homes and, and all this stuff, the home, I always thought homes were a really weird asset anyway. I don't know, maybe I'm just strange. I'm like, these things I can't pick it up and move, man. What's the deal here, and it's the transaction costs are quite large on those things in terms of liquidity. But the system itself has this thing, the home, it's like, and I get it, you want stability of the family and so forth, the communities, and you can set property taxes on the home, you can collect it for the schools, et cetera. But one thing Brad said, and what I want to get back to, is that there was a big push, and this is the thing that when I said that I supported the government bailout at the point, but I didn't support is what led up to the bailout. And here's the point that I have to agree with Brad on this, is that part of a lot of the banking system, the financial system, and it's been going on for a long time, is there's been underlying a lot of financial industries, there's an underlying adverse selection moral hazard problem, like who shows up to a bank? Are you getting the best credit customers in a bank? Let's think about it for a minute. If you really had money, I don't have to deal with the bank maybe, right? So you got to be cognizant of the customers you're dealing with in terms of lending, but even when you make the loan, you want to make sure that people are doing what they say they're going to use the loan for, right? What's happened in the U.S., and this part goes back to the government, is that there's such a push for the housing market and so forth. Greenspan kept interest rates incredibly low for too long. I mean, I blame a lot of it on Greenspan and the interest rate environment. It made it almost so cheap. Let's buy the home. Oh, by the way, there's a loophole. We can get, let's get that second mortgage and so forth. And then basic fundamentals of just collateral to get a loan went out the door. So part of it is that the system itself, just to encourage one sector of the economy, was just fusing it too much. It was just throwing gasoline on a fire. But the underlying problem is, at the same time, is that, and this is where I think it's important that there's a role for government here in terms of some degree of regulation to the fact of understanding financial innovation, is the fact at the same time they're developing all these credit default swaps, mortgage-backed securities. Take all the mortgages, package them, sell the revenue stream off. People buy the revenue stream on the mortgages themselves as a security. And then if you're smart, you package some bad ones in with a few good ones to hide it, get a good rating. And they were very hot because the market was hot. But that innovation in itself is that the Securities Exchange Commission should be paying attention to it, right? So we got in a situation where, in some sense, the government at the outset should have been more cognizant of what was going on. And the fact that the interest rates were so low for so long, I mean, it was pretty much like, how long can this go on? This is unprecedented. And so, when all of a sudden, interest rates start going up and these things start going down, and part of it was the modeling of these things. They assumed, like, in some cases, because I had a friend, advisory board member I worked before, worked for a hedge fund at Wellington Management. He said, yeah, we go down and we have to explain to the SEC the financial innovations. They don't have the sophistication to understand them. So they can, they're literally running, they captured the regulatory body by default. And the point is that the modeling was out of, they're assuming housing prices are going to going forever, up to 8-9% a year. Houses don't appreciate that fast, right? But that's the assumption. So the modeling was way out of whack. And then when the market started collapsing, and then all of a sudden, these mortgage-backed securities become worthless, and then you had this whole downward spiral, and everybody's going out. At that point, the problem was the externality came on the average person that wasn't even part of the transaction of these mortgage-backed securities that once originated and repackaged. And so at that point, the real problem became other sectors of the economy. That's the point I made. It was going to be adversely affected by the credit squeeze. I mean, your basic local business wasn't able to get lines of credit from the banks. Just, hell no, I'm not lending anything out. This whole retrenchment. And so in that sense, I can see where you had to bail out. But I also agree is that the too big to fail mentality is there on Wall Street and the risk factor. And part of that is trying to discipline them at the outset to prevent the risk-taking that they're exposing others to. And that's still something I think is very real. I don't know if the government's actually addressed that.
Can I be allowed to follow up real quick?
Yeah.
So, bearing that in mind, do you think that the liability issues that, the protections from liability that a corporation allows should be adjusted in some way so that those who were involved in making these decisions and engaging in this kind of practice can be brought to trial for the kind of behavior that they've
Yeah, I
engaged
mean,
in?
I think, there's some of these cases that I've seen, you usually see them if they're not trickling in the back of the Wall Street Journal or something like that, unless it's you got a Madoff case running around or something like that. But I think they're trying to bring people to justice on some of these things, especially if there's demonstrated fraud. I'm just looking at the fact is, are they really keeping the institutions responsible for the risk, assessing the risk at the outset? Not fraud, just realize that there's risk. Okay. And discipline it. That's different from fraud. And like the Madoff, we're going to have a Ponzi scheme or something. That's different. I'm not legitimizing your Madoffs out there. But the fact is they should have been more proactive in understanding, the government should have, and the Federal Reserve and so forth, that the fact that these instruments, the way they were being modeled, were incredibly risky. But there was no exposure for the banks to say, yeah, well, they're going to look at it more in terms of the responsibility for that financial instrument. Okay. But to say all of a sudden, this is the thing that I think it's important, and I think Brad will agree with me, and if you say, well, we don't want to do that anymore, it's a financial innovation, that's not good either. Because you want financial innovation, different products that develop, but at the outset, the government needs to be ahead of the curve in understanding the nuances of those financial instruments. Okay. And that's what a colleague of mine that was at hedge funds tell me. He's like, the SEC is so far behind. It's crazy. And basically, it's like a training ground. They just get the bright kids and then move them into the firm from the SEC.
30-second comment. I worked at the Florida Public Service Commission when we were in graduate school, and I saw exactly this happen. If you were a good analyst at the Public Service Commission, you were hired away to Sprint. You went to Atlanta, you were paid 20 grand a year as a state worker, you were paid 30 grand a year at Sprint, and off you went. If you think that the smartest people are going to go into the regulation of these companies and they're not going to be hired away by the companies themselves, you're just very naive. I mean, that's the way it works. And so the only way to beat a really, really good lawyer is hire a better one. And they know that. I mean, they know that. Corporations and other, corporations are a legal shell. And they're a very important component of handling risk inside of a system. Mm-hmm. And so we have to have that, because I can own stock in a company, and if the only thing I'm subjected to is the value of the stock as a loss, right? They can't come and get my house and take away my kid's college fund. And it's a tool for which almost all of us have abilities. Anyone with a pension fund, anyone with any kind of investment has to have access to those kind of corporations.
Hey, so the way I see it is you guys are pretty much arguing the same side of capitalism, just different flavors. I mean, on one hand, you're offering the more libertarian capitalism and you're offering the more left capitalism. But in essence, if the system has any flaws, then a better system should be chosen. You could solve these problems of inequality by completely disregarding the capitalist system and using an alternative. And when you compare the course of time from the beginning of human history or to now, and obviously people are advancing because our technology gets better, it's like that's still all capitalist, pre-capitalist systems into a capitalist system, into like a crony system. And a crony system is almost guaranteed to happen because the goal of winning capitalism is to get into cronyism, because you get to make the rules, and that's any game you play. From a child, the way to win is to change the rules. So when you have a capitalist system that creates this you versus me versus you system, I'm going to figure out a way to win, and by winning, you change the rules. So what I'm saying is, do you think there's any way to propose an alternative system that does not fall into the capitalist spectrum to solve these social issues in humanity as a whole?
Well, can I chime in? Mm-hmm. First, feel free to throw out any alternative you have, and I'm not trying to be a smart ass or anything, but let's say we want to go to communism, okay? I'm just throwing out another system, you know, just for,
Well, why is it so absurd? If you remove the idea of nations or anything and you do humanity as a whole, a project, then all issues are just problems to be solved. And in a technological society, you can create a completely unbiased system that allows the movement of goods through preferences of your population and what is desired and what is wanted, and you just solve the needs with the resources you have. And in a society where you pretty much have infinite amount of anything, more than we could possibly use in any one year or month or day, you can actually solve the needs of everyone by completely allocating everything in the
okay.
most efficient.
So we'll go with your model. We'll go with your model. Okay, so I'm just gonna ask you questions. And so what you described to me is kind of like a Soviet-style model. So to do that, you have to have what? You have to have a central planner who's doing the allocation, right? I mean, let's go back to the Soviet Union. And so, okay, so let's say it's working. Let's say you have a central planner that's allocating everything. Then the one thing you mentioned about technological advances. So if I'm working in that system, and my job responsibility is to put these widgets into this, and someone else has a different responsibility, and that's what we do. Irrespective of what our talent level is, right? That I might be the best nuclear physicist in the world, but I'm assigned to this task, all right? And you're going along, but other countries don't have the same system. And so all of a sudden, these other systems maybe have capitalisms or some variant or hybrid of capitalism or something where the government's more dominant than the capitalist piece of the economy or vice versa. And then you start seeing technological advances. And yet there's no way, how are you going to respond to them? It's like, oh, we're going to respond to it. My point being here is like, ask yourself, why did the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe fall apart? And the reason I say that, I've spent time in Yugoslavia before it disintegrated into these republics. And it was really interesting when I talked to people that there was a social self-management system. It was kind of like this hybrid, funky socialist model. They weren't communists. You mentioned communists, shame on you. That's a no-no. We're social self-management. And it had some markets in there, some private markets, but they said, yeah, we've been running markets all along. Because everything that the central planner wanted was not reflecting the taste and preferences of the population. So it's called the black market. They were running forever. And they had an extreme level of corruption because the pricing system that they used to kind of allocate was not reflective of the real market prices for things. You see, so that's kind of the problem with that kind of model, is that you need, the capitalist system is based on prices in terms of trying to allocate resources. The key is, to get it to work right, is that you got to make sure no one's trying to distort the prices in the system. And some of these government interferences distort the prices, which creates opportunities for people to capture rents and so forth.
I have to say, in that system, there wouldn't be other countries.
No,
There's no.
So world communism, all world communism, right?
So there's no nation to buy against. And the people you'd be placed, like you said, the example of like, if I'm the world's best nuclear physicist, you'd be a nuclear physicist doing the best work because it'd be the most efficient use of your talent. It's like, if you were the best at doing something, you're going to go do that because it helps society as a whole.
Ethics issue.
Let me ask this just for a second. So is the argument that you think that in theory, capitalism is the best system, or is it just, look, in practice, this is what we see? Because this sounds theoretically ideal. And the question again is perhaps a practical one, whether that could be achieved.
Well, I mean, the idea of the master planner, I mean, that's what I was saying, like, you could use a computer to do that, totally unbiased. The reason I think the Soviet system fell because, well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of the major economic issues is that it was done by humans and on manpower, as opposed to what you can do today with technology is, like, companies in capitalism know what to sell you because they track all the stuff you're doing, and they can get data from you. It's like, we know to make khakis are going to be sold this season because a bunch of people are looking at khakis, so we're going to make them trendy.
but what's the incentive for someone to be the master planner? I mean, who designates them the master planner? I'm playing devil's advocate here.
Why do people go
If you
into
determine
public
limits,
engineering
then
majors?
their incentive can only be for the betterment of society.
You said the computer would allocate goods in an unbiased way. Last I checked, all computers are programmed by human beings. And until we have a sentient computer that will be a benevolent dictator, I think you're probably wrong.
How am I wrong? 'Cause we do
Where are you gonna find these angels?
The stock market is a computer that tells us what we want.
Let me just move on. Let me just move on. John, and then I'll go back over here.
I would, I just want to suggest that the Pope's comments about, I understand where he's coming from and what he's seeing, but I would like to suggest that his comments are misguided. It seems to me, if you look at capitalism as an economic system, it's just that, an economic system. An economic system, just like the American public education system, cannot possibly be moral or immoral. It's only human beings that can be moral or immoral. So what we're really talking about is the administration or implementation of the current system. I might add that it's just my personal opinion, I spent some time in Yugoslavia myself, as well as a couple of other more communist type of countries. As a system, that is more conducive, in my opinion, to corruption than any other system that we have here.
Yeah.
But I do believe that what we have here is crony capitalism. It's probably leaning, or at least it's trending in the long term towards kind of an oligarchy, like almost like you have now in Russia, it seems like. And so it's really the administration or the implementation of the system. I think this, by the statistics that you gave out earlier, Brad, on the history of progress through the free enterprise system, I would rather call it, it's administered by human beings. So they're the ones who are probably creating this crony capitalism that we now see ourselves working under. So we could all argue for, who knows how many months and years here about which is the best way. I tend to be more of a libertarian, I guess, myself, even though I'm not completely in that camp. But to try to put the label of morality on an economic system, I think is somewhat misguided. As long as there's people involved, then it can be immoral. Now look at the Catholic Church, and I grew up as a Catholic. Certainly there was a lot of immorality in the implementation of that religious system. Would I say that the Catholic Church is immoral? No. It's a religious system.
Do you agree with that we're asking the wrong question when we're talking about morality and economic systems?
No, I think he makes a good point. I mean, I think a lot of it depends on the characters in the play, and that's the individuals. And then individuals ultimately make up the institutions.
Well, I'm in the
And so the
investment business,
problem-
so I thoroughly agree with the statements about, the cause and effect of coming up to the
The banking
crisis in
situation. Yeah.
2008 and Greenspan, et cetera. So,
Yeah.
but those are individuals, and they're vying for power and control.
Right.
And ultimately, it did create the too big to fail mentality out there.
Yeah, but I think underlying it's the institutions and who makes up the institute. I mean, who makes up the government? Well, everybody in here, essentially. But in terms of the actual representation from the government in terms of interest, that's where I'm talking about the crony capitalism in terms of how Brad mentioned who sets up the rules wins in terms of the rent-seeking behavior you see, not just in the U.S., you see it in other countries as well. It's just more sophisticated levels of corruption from my vantage point. And so it's an access issue for people. And my thing is, there's a role for government. I think Brad, I would say the government plays an important role, right? Brad would say, just give me the property rights and enforcement of them. I argue that given certain things, I don't know that Brad, do you believe in public goods?
Not really.
Okay, he doesn't believe in public goods. So I believe in some level of public good. That's our basic difference, maybe. Because like I'm saying, a lot of my frustration is just looking at how much we spend in government, how we're not managing our fiscal affairs, and I'm not advocating for a balanced budget. I think there's problems with that. But the fact is that a lot of our resources, I think, have been misallocated to the detriment of individuals and the infrastructure for industry, higher education system, and so forth in terms of our infrastructure that is not going to bode well for us 30 years down the road in terms of what you see other countries and how they're spending government. So I look at government as this. Government's important for what Brad's talking about, enforcement of property rights and so forth, the judicial system to enforce the property rights, et cetera, what you're doing. But I also, am I boring you that much with fanning already? But anyway.
I'm sorry, guys, it's hot here. We're only-
Oh, I'm fine. But I think it's important for the government expenditures being investment. Government investment rather than government consumption. And I think a lot of what we've done has been government consumption, you know. And I think that's been a misuse of taxpayers' dollars. That's just my view.
Just trying to get a couple more questions. I saw you, and then we'll get there two in the back, and then, yeah.
Yeah, I would say I agree. Central planning is unavoidable. I mean, it occurs in business as well, right? But then, I think maybe you got some sneaking socialism. You wanted the government to intervene in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe if the Federal Reserve, why is it called the Fed, and yet it's a private bank, you know?
Well, it's an
If-
independent, it reports to the
if its
Congress, yeah.
accounting was fully transparent with technology and stuff like that, that would, I think, resolve some of those issues.
No, I think even before then, I mean, I think the Fed's to blame for it. Like I said, Greenspan, who's the chairman, kept interest rates way too low, was fueling this thing. And then on top of that, not really monitoring the development of these financial assets and how much they were growing, how fast they were being developed in terms of being held in portfolios in banks across the world. I mean, that's the thing that really just started the contagion when interest rates started going up and then the value of these things started going down. So.
I would just comment that on these instruments, I don't think there's any way they can ever monitor the instruments. The only way to do that is to tell you that if you want to play with the sharpest knife in the world, get ready to have your hand cut off, and we're not going to fix it for you. That's what's going to stop them from doing that. But we were in a situation where people were putting together these instruments, and what you had was Fannie and Freddie saying, we'll buy whatever you push through the system. And that's how we lost all of that monitoring that should have been there. When I went to buy my first house, I had to have 20% down, cash, and I did. And that completely went out the window. And if you tell a salesman that you're going to get a commission on a sale for a mortgage, and then the bosses know that if the salesman makes the sale, that they can just pass a hot potato right off to the federal government, they'll do it every time. And so what happened is Fannie and Freddie mushroomed. They became huge, huge, huge. And we need to monitor those instruments, but I don't think that any regulator is going to be able to do it. I think what you have to do is let people suffer the consequences of acting badly, whatever that is.
But, I'm sorry, do those people actually suffer those consequences?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Because the U.S. Treasury is filled with Goldman Sachs bankers, in my view.
Sure. So somebody should rise in mild defense of the Pope, right? He's been getting pilloried as sort of naive.
Actually, this guy seems reasonable relative to the other ones they've had. And I'm not Catholic, I'm not
Right.
passing judgment, but you know.
So the first thing you say is the English translator nodded a bit. The phrasing is actually the market alone. He left out one pretty important word there, which assumed that economic growth encouraged by a free market alone will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. That word alone is in the Latin, the Spanish, the Italian, and the German. It's not in the English because of a translation thing. That's really important because it means that the Pope and Brad are actually pretty diametrically opposed, it seems, because that seems to be an argument directly against the sort of strict libertarianism of, yes, actually it is the market.
You're scaring me saying if I'm more in line with the Pope, I don't know. I mean, I don't know.
So that it is the market alone, but here's, so the Pope's kind of wily and seems pretty naive in some of these things, but on reflection, I wonder if it's not the opposite of that, if he's not being very realistic here, and in this way. Here's an example of how this might work out. So Brad's ideal, at least as I can hear it tonight, his ideal economic system depends on people being responsible for the consequences of their decisions, which in itself depends on their making free choices. Because if they weren't free to choose this option or that option, then it seems unreasonable to hold them entirely responsible for the consequences of having chosen those two things, right? That's one of the reasons he opposes coercion. And yet, it seems like one's circumstances can so constrain one's ability to choose that choice ceases to be free. An example might be if you're really, really hungry. If you don't have enough food to eat, then it seems like your circumstances are now constraining your choices. You're going to choose to do things and subject yourself to things that you wouldn't. You think are immoral, you think are wrong, and you won't do that. So what the Pope so here's an example of the sort of thing the Pope might argue for. If the the society were to create a program which would ensure that there's a certain base level of nutrition met. We have this program in the U.S. So just to take the devil's advocate, just to play the devil's advocate here, we've got this SNAP program, which used to be called food stamps. It involves about $76 billion a year, serves 48 million people. But two key facts, the federal government overhead on it is only 3.7 million. So it's basically a rounding, it basically costs us nothing at the federal level. It's basically a rounding error. It's less than 0.1%. And the CBO says the multiplier of it is 1.72, which is a pretty good return on our collective investment. And the biggest benefit, I might add, is that I get to sleep at night knowing that no one in this country need starve, and no one need have their circumstances, at least with regard to food, so tightly constrained that they're no longer free to make the kinds of choices that you say are essential to the economy. So what's the libertarian response to that sort of Franciscan argument?
Well, I mean, my response is that if you take obligations to others seriously, then how much income are you giving? And if you want to use force to take it from other people to give to them, what is the moral standing that you have to use that force? So I have no problems with people giving all of their money away. If you want to be an ascetic and give everything you have away, that's your decision. I'm all for it. And in fact, wealth itself ends up that way anyway. My grandfather had a great saying, it's coffins don't have pockets. No one buries themselves surrounded by packages of $100 bills. When Bill Gates dies, and even now, all the money, all the wealth he generated has to go back in some way. You can give it to your children, and you end up with gin and boats and cocaine. I've seen it many times. Or you can give it away for other things. Vanderbilt built what? The New York City library system. This money has to go somewhere. Now, you can disapprove with where the money goes, but if you're willing to use force to take the money, I've got a problem with that. And if you truly believe, then I think that you should give part of your income. I give a certain percentage of my income away every year on purpose. I give it to things that I support. I encourage anyone who has the ability to do that to do so. But we have lots of evidence that people talk a good game, but when you look at their income tax returns, they're not acting like they're talking. It's okay if they get somebody else to do it. They're willing to do that. But they themselves, that's what I mean by the responsibility. And it is difficult.
Jim, Brad, you want to give us some final thoughts? We've got about a minute or two. Either Brad or Jim?
Dan Aykroyd, Jane Curtin? No, I'm sorry, no, I'm just kidding.
I mean, the only thing
I haven't seen him in 20-something years, so
it's
just
been a
kind of
while.
funny.
I guess my only closing comment was that I came to economics as a young person. I was in my early 20s. From a Latin American history degree, I was interested in economics because I wanted to make the world a better place, and I was interested in history and revolution, and the left because I want to make the world a better place. And over time, I've morphed. There's no doubt about it. I have made a transition that Hayek made, that Buchanan made, and I think that Nozick made too. And that is I came down on a libertarian side. Is it perfect? Wrought with crooked timber like all things. And that's about, I guess that's the end of what I have to say in a minute or two.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm pretty much, I don't know if I don't know where if I've morphed or anything. I don't know. I'm just kind of just older. No, I mean, I like I said, we overlapped at graduate school, and so I can see where he got some influences given the department we were in was, how would you describe that department?
It was a mix. I mean, we had some pretty strong Keynesians.
A mix? Okay.
A mix.
Yeah, a mix. We had some mainstream economists, and we had some was it Canterbury, left the center, and then we had
I did my
Sobel,
dissertation.
and then we had some on the very right fringe. It was I would imagine if I was a faculty member of the department, man, you'd be walking a tightrope, making sure you didn't irritate anybody. But anyway, so it's no closing remarks. I mean, I just hope people just, think critically about, the government's role. And, my view is that I think there's a role of government, probably more so than Brad does. Although I do think there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of how the government delivers what it does. And having a priority set that aligns with the longer-term perspective of the U.S. than what I've currently seen, regardless if you're Democrat or Republican, what I've seen in the actions. It seems very short-sighted, which I guess we can talk about political economy sometimes, but that's just the kind of concern. So I think we overlap on certain aspects. I wouldn't go as far as being, Tilda Hun over here or whatever, Austrian on me or whatever. So I'll just conclude with that about that.
That's the third time I've cut off the provost, which is probably not a good
No, that's
thing.
fine. Trust me, I just met with engineering for 2 hours. I was getting cut off everywhere. So.
Well, if you're interested in the discussion of money and politics, we'll be joined next Wednesday at this time, 6 o'clock, with former Governor Buddy Bromer and Jim Stoner from LSU. I will do my best to try to get the air conditioning on, but please join me in thanking Brett Hobbs and Jim Payne.